Welcome to Daily Dreamer, the podcast that provides practical tips and insights to help you reach your biggest dreams. Tune in for daily doses of motivation, inspiration, and actionable advice to turn your aspirations into reality. Whether you're looking to find clarity, boost your confidence, or stay on track with your goals, Daily Dreamer is here to guide you every step of the way.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're diving into this interview you sent me with Patrick Bet-David on Piers Morgan Uncensored. Seems like you're pretty interested in what Bet-David had to say about the 2024 election, all the stuff about media and even global power dynamics, especially when it comes to Trump.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really interesting interview, offers a glimpse, I guess you could say, into a very specific worldview. One that I think is probably pretty common, actually. It does touch on some sensitive topics, though, so we'll have to navigate those carefully as we go.
He doesn't exactly shy away from anything, does he?
Yeah.
Bet-David makes some pretty bold claims. I'm interested to get your take on, how he analyzes Trump's tactics, all that dark strategy stuff. He even brings up these pretty extreme scenarios, like talking about how Trump's opponents would need to shut down the internet or create power grids to beat him.
Yeah, it's pretty strong language for sure. But I think what he's trying to do is emphasize just how hard it would be to defeat Trump. He really seems to believe that. The sense you get is that, that the usual political tactics wouldn't work against someone like Trump, given his unique approach and how fiercely loyal his base is.
So he's basically saying Trump's practically invincible then?
Almost, yeah. Like he's saying the only way to derail Trump would be something totally disruptive, something that really shakes up the system. He even compares Trump to, get this, Roy Cohn, the mob lawyer.
Wow, that's something. For anyone who doesn't know, Roy Cohn was known for being super aggressive. No-holds-barred tactics. Had a reputation for winning no matter what, even if it meant, bending the rules. What do you think Bet-David's getting at with that comparison?
I think it says a lot about how he views leadership. He seems to admire that ruthlessness, that take-no-prisoners approach. Those are the qualities you need to make it in politics today.
So even though Bet-David supports Trump, he's comparing him to someone who, while effective, wasn't exactly known for being ethical. Is he implying that it's better to be effective than moral?
That's a really good question, and it's something we see throughout the interview. Bet-David consistently frames Trump as a disruptor, someone who breaks the mold and connects with voters who feel like the establishment's left them behind. That's what he sees as Trump's biggest strength.
And he ties that right into the whole rise of podcasts, too. Bet-David thinks Trump's use of podcasts has let him skip over traditional media and talk directly to his supporters, build his own independent platform.
Right. And it's a tactic we've seen work for others, too. He specifically mentions Bobby Kennedy Jr. and Vivek Ramaswamy. They've both used podcasts to build a following and challenge, the usual narratives you hear in the media.
It's interesting because this bypassing the traditional gatekeepers thing, it seems like it's happening everywhere, not just politics. Is Bet-David suggesting that these alternative platforms are actually becoming the main force behind shaping public opinion now?
He definitely hints at it. He even says that people who don't adapt to this new media landscape are going to get, quote, destroyed, unquote. Doesn't matter how qualified they are or how successful they've been in the past. He makes a business analogy talking about how companies that don't keep up get overtaken by the competition.
Ouch. That's a pretty harsh warning. Seems like he's putting a lot of emphasis on adaptability, this need to connect directly with your audience no matter what. But even though Bet-David supports Trump, he does admit that Trump's leadership style has some potential flaws, right?
Yeah, he does. He points out that Trump's transactional style, always focused on making deals, that works in business, but it might not always be the best fit for politics, which often involves getting people to agree and building relationships.
He even questions whether Trump's ego could actually hold him back from leaving a real legacy behind. Kind of surprising to hear him say that, given how much he supports Trump overall.
Yeah. It suggests that even the people who really admire Trump's strengths recognize that certain aspects of his personality could become a problem in the long run.
Adds some nuance to his analysis for sure, which is good. Now, Bet-David also gets into economics. He's a big advocate for a more protectionist approach. And he uses this really simple analogy, comparing trade deficits to a bad business deal.
It's an analogy that really resonates with people who feel like globalization has benefited other countries more than the U.S.
He talks specifically about tariffs as a way to basically force other countries to buy from us. He sees that as the way to level the playing field. Pretty strong stance.
It connects to this broader theme we'll be getting into, this idea of the world as a zero-sum game. Like one country's gain always means another country's loss. And competition, not cooperation, is what really drives global dynamics.
That's a good point. And that leads right into his more worrying predictions about the future. Bet David talks about potential conflicts with Iran, a continued focus on deportations. He even mentions separating families. Pretty alarming stuff.
Yeah, it does raise some red flags, especially when you think about his stance on immigration. He frames it as this big threat to national security and the economy. It's a very hardline stance for sure. Very much in line with, what you typically hear from nationalist perspectives.
Definitely. And it's something we've seen gain traction in recent years with all the America First rhetoric. Makes you wonder if that kind of talk actually contributes to the anxieties Bet David says younger generations are dealing with.
It's an interesting thought. I mean, he expresses concern about the anxiety he sees, but at the same time, his own rhetoric could be part of the problem. Maybe it's an unintended consequence, or is it actually part of a calculated strategy?
That's something to think about for sure. It's complicated. Anyway, moving on a bit, Bet David also brings up something you highlighted in your notes. This apparent increase in support for Trump among Black and Latino voters seems kind of counterintuitive, given all the accusations of racism that get thrown at Trump.
Exactly. It's a real head-scratcher. Bet David seems to think the idea that Trump's rhetoric or policies are actually appealing to these voters is nonsense. Instead, he frames it as a rejection of the Democratic Party. Like, they've failed to deliver for these communities, so people are getting disillusioned and looking for other options.
So he's not saying these voters actually buy into Trump's ideology, more like they're just expressing their dissatisfaction with the current state of things.
Right. He suggests that the Democratic Party's focus on, identity politics and social justice has alienated some voters, people who are more focused on economic issues or who have different cultural values.
Interesting perspective. Could it be that the Democratic Party, in trying to broaden their appeal, has actually pushed away some of their traditional base?
It's definitely possible, this potential disconnect between what the party's saying and the reality for some voters. That could be a factor in this shift we're seeing. Bet David contrasts that with what he sees as Trump's more straightforward approach, focused on economic growth, jobs, strong national defense.
So he's painting Trump as a pragmatist, less concerned with grand ideas and more focused on concrete results. Exactly.
And he thinks that resonates with voters who feel like their basic needs aren't being met. Doesn't matter their race or ethnicity. It plays into that narrative of Trump as the disruptor, the outsider who's not afraid to shake things up.
And it's interesting how he uses that same disruptor label for the changing media landscape, too. He argues that traditional media outlets are losing their relevance, being replaced by independent voices like podcasters and YouTubers. And he gives Trump credit for recognizing that and capitalizing on it.
He specifically mentions Trump's appearances on podcasts like Joe Rogan's, saying that those appearances helped him reach a much bigger and more diverse audience.
He even said that Trump's interview with Joe Rogan got more views than all of Kamala Harris's interviews combined.
Wow, that's a big statement. Hard to know for sure without, the actual data, but it definitely highlights how much reach and influence these alternative platforms can have.
And it feeds into this whole narrative of Trump as the anti-establishment figure, someone who's willing to engage with audiences outside the traditional media bubble. Bet David contrasts that with what he calls the desperation of the establishment. He thinks they're losing their power and resorting to, more and more extreme tactics to hold on.
He points to all the accusations of Trump being a Nazi or a Hitler as proof of this desperation. He thinks those attacks are not only ineffective, but actually counterproductive.
He argues that those labels have lost their meaning from being overused. And that most people just see them as desperate attempts to smear a political opponent.
Yeah. He suggests that kind of rhetoric actually alienates moderate voters and makes Trump's base even more supportive.
It all ties back to his point about the media landscape changing. He sees those traditional gatekeepers of information as losing credibility, while these independent voices are gaining more and more traction.
It reflects a wider trend in society. This distrust of institutions and, established authorities, it's been building for decades, and it's really impacting how we take in information and how we see the world.
And Bet David's prediction is that anyone who doesn't adapt to this new reality, anyone who clings to the old ways and doesn't connect directly with their audience, they're going to get left behind. He uses this pretty striking image talking about the corpses of those who didn't evolve littering the media landscape.
It's a powerful metaphor. It really highlights the sense of disruption and transformation that he thinks we're going through.
And it's not just media. He applies that same adapt or die principle to everything: politics, economics, even global affairs. Now, Bet David also expresses some concern about the future, citing global events and what he sees as a decline in American values. He mentions economic instability, potential conflicts with Iran, and the perceived threat of unchecked immigration.
Yeah, it paints a pretty bleak picture, one where the future feels uncertain and the traditional power structures are being challenged.
He's tapping into this feeling of unease that a lot of people have about where things are headed. It's a feeling that's often, exploited by people who are trying to gain power or influence.
And he combines that with this call for a more assertive foreign policy, arguing that the U.S. needs to project strength, defend its interests on the world stage.
It fits with this us versus them mentality that we see throughout his analysis: politics, economics, international relations. He presents this picture of a world divided into winners and losers. And America has to fight to stay on top.
He even brings up concerns about Russia's vast natural resources, implying that maybe certain powerful entities, maybe financial institutions, are actually profiting from conflicts like the war in Ukraine.
That's a bold claim, and it plays into this distrust and suspicion people have towards these powerful, often unseen forces.
Yeah, he even suggests that these entities might actually benefit from the rebuilding efforts after conflicts end, implying that their support for intervention is, less than altruistic.
That's a disturbing thought, this idea that there's this hidden agenda behind these global events. It plays on our fears and this human tendency to look for patterns even when they're not really there.
It's a tactic you see a lot from people who want to sow division and exploit our anxiety.
And yet, despite this rather bleak outlook, Bet David also talks about a bright future, emphasizing the need to go back to traditional values, focus on American strength and prosperity.
It's an interesting contrast. On one hand, he's describing a world on the brink of disaster, but on the other hand, he's offering this message of hope and renewal. It's a common tactic in nationalist rhetoric.
He seems to be saying that, there are challenges, but America can overcome them, reclaim its place as a global leader. But it requires a change in thinking, a return to a more traditional set of values.
It appeals to the sense of nostalgia, a yearning for a simpler time when America was seen as dominant, unchallenged.
It's a powerful story, and one that definitely resonates with a certain segment of the population. Speaking of powerful stories, Bet David ends on a pretty provocative note. He repeats his belief that the future is bright, but only for those who adopt what he calls a paranoid mindset.
That's an odd thing to say. He's basically saying that to succeed in this uncertain world, you need to be constantly on guard, always looking out for potential threats.
Seems kind of contradictory. He's pushing this optimistic view of the future, but at the same time, he's promoting this mindset based on fear and suspicion.
Yeah, it's a tough line to walk. He's saying, be hopeful, but be ready, Embrace the future, but watch out for danger. It reflects this worldview where the world is inherently unstable, like you can never really relax.
It's a worldview a lot of people probably share these days with all the uncertainty and rapid change happening. But stepping back for a second, what really stood out to me in this whole interview was Bet David's storytelling. He's good at it.
Oh, absolutely. He weaves these narratives. They tap into deep anxieties, aspirations too. He offers this sense of clarity, I guess, purpose. In a world that feels chaotic and unpredictable, whether you buy into his perspective or not, it's easy to see why so many people find it compelling.
He creates this picture of a world divided between people who are, awake to the truth and those who are still asleep, being manipulated by the establishment. It's a powerful story. And those can be really persuasive, especially when people are afraid and things feel uncertain.
Classic us versus them framing. We see it everywhere he talks about politics, media, global affairs. It's this idea that there's this constant battle for power, and you have to pick a side.
It's a pretty stark view of things, and it could lead to more polarization and division.
It could, yeah. But it also speaks to this very human need to belong, to have a purpose, to feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself.
And that's what makes Bet David's message so interesting. He combines that us versus them thing with a call to action.
Yeah.
This idea that you can empower yourself through knowledge and vigilance.
Right. He tells his audience to be skeptical of the mainstream narratives, to look for alternative sources of information, to really think critically about the world. It's a message that speaks to people who feel like the system's failed them, the people who are ignored by those in power.
It taps into this sense of agency, self-reliance, this belief that you can control your own destiny, shape your own future.
And it's not just about individual empowerment either. He also talks about community, connection. He sees these alternative media platforms, podcasts especially, as a way for people with similar ideas to connect, share those ideas outside the confines of the traditional media.
So it creates this sense of belonging, a shared purpose. That's more than just taking in information. It's about being part of a movement.
Exactly. And that feeling of belonging is powerful, especially when you combine it with someone as charismatic as Trump.
It helps explain why his supporters are so passionate. It goes beyond just agreeing with his policies. It's about being part of something bigger, something that feels meaningful, transformative even.
This whole interview really gives us a look inside a particular way of seeing the world, one shaped by a deep distrust of institutions, a belief in individual empowerment, and this longing for a return to a time when America was seen as strong and prosperous.
And whether you agree with what he's saying or not, I think understanding these viewpoints is really important if we want to navigate the current political landscape and all the cultural changes happening in the world.
His insights, even the ones that seem controversial, they challenge us to examine our own assumptions, to have a more thoughtful conversation about the future we want.
It's a good reminder. In a world that's becoming more and more complex, more and more interconnected, understanding different points of view is essential if we want to build empathy, build bridges, find common ground.
I think Bet David's interview, in a way, it's like a case study, a microcosm of the bigger forces that are shaping the world. It highlights the anxieties, the aspirations, the stories that are driving political polarization, and this search for meaning in a world that feels increasingly uncertain.
It's a call to engage more, to really listen, to recognize that shared humanity that connects us all, even when we disagree.
It's a good reminder that we're not just, watching this happen. We're active participants in shaping the future, individually and together.
That's a great point. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Hope you found it helpful and that it's given you some new things to think about.
As always, keep sending us your sources. We'll be here to help you make sense of it all.